You've been here before. Maybe on a long, lonely road at midnight, where the streetlights flickered just a little too much. Maybe in a small town that wasn't on your map, where the people stared just a little too long. Or maybe deep in the woods, where the silence felt wrong. The middle of nowhere is never truly empty. Shadows move where they shouldn't. Voices whisper when no one's around. Some places don't just swallow people, they keep them. These 5 tales will take you there. To lost highways, forgotten towns, and eerie backroads where reality bends and nightmares slip through the cracks. So buckle up, keep your doors locked, and whatever you do, don't stop. Danny had been driving for hours. The desert highway stretched out endlessly under the black sky, the stars watching him like cold, distant eyes. The yellow lines on the asphalt blurred together, and his fingers felt numb against the steering wheel. He hadn't seen another car in over an hour. His gas gauge hovered dangerously close to empty, the needle barely hanging above E. His stomach twisted. Running out of gas in the middle of the desert? That was the kind of thing that made headlines. Tourist found dehydrated, body picked clean by vultures. Then, like a mirage, he saw it. An old gas station flickering in the distance. Relief washed over him. He blinked, half expecting the image to vanish, but the station remained. A squat, weathered building with dusty gas pumps and a single, dim light glowing above the door. Danny pulled in and cut the engine. The silence swallowed him. No wind, no crickets, nothing. Just the steady hum of the flickering neon open sign. Through the grimy window, he saw an old man behind the counter. His skin was pale, almost waxy, and his eyes, something about them was off. Too wide. Too bright. Danny pushed open his door, the hinge groaning. Gravel crunched under his boots as he approached the pump. He cleared his throat. "Fill her up?" The old man didn't speak, just nodded and shuffled outside. His movements were strange, stiff, like a puppet with strings being pulled too hard. Danny exhaled, rubbing his temples. Maybe he was just exhausted. He pulled out his phone. No signal. Of course. The gas station lights flickered, and the old man was suddenly right next to his window. Danny jumped, his breath catching in his throat. He hadn't heard him move. The old man leaned in, his cracked lips stretching into a grin. His teeth were too white, too straight, like they didn't belong in his mouth. "You shouldn't be here," he whispered. Danny's pulse hammered in his ears. His gut screamed at him to leave. He fumbled with the ignition, his fingers shaking. The engine roared to life, and he slammed his foot on the gas. The tires screeched as he sped off, dirt and gravel kicking up behind him. He didn't look back. Not until he was far enough down the road, his heart slowing. Danny glanced in the rearview mirror. There was nothing behind him. No gas station. No lights. Just an endless, empty road. His hands tightened around the steering wheel. That didn't make sense. Had he imagined it? Maybe exhaustion was playing tricks on him. Maybe it was some kind of dream, one of those weird half-awake hallucinations. But his gas gauge told a different story. It was full. He hadn't paid. Danny's throat went dry. His mind raced, trying to make sense of it. Had he blacked out? Had he imagined the whole thing? No. The old man was real. The way he moved, the way he whispered, Danny could still hear his voice in his ears. "You shouldn't be here." A chill crawled down his spine. He shook his head. Forget it. Just get to the next town. A motel. A real gas station. People. Danny drove. The road stretched endlessly ahead. He kept checking the mirror, expecting to see headlights. A car. Anything. But there was nothing. Just black sky. Just empty road. Then he saw the lights. Up ahead, glowing in the distance. His stomach twisted. No, it couldn't be. As he got closer, his blood turned to ice. The same gas station. The same dusty pumps. The same peeling paint. The same dim light above the door. Danny's hands went numb. His breath came in short gasps. No, that was impossible. He had driven in a straight line. He hadn't turned. He hadn't doubled back. And yet, there it was. The same gas station. Waiting for him. A shadow moved inside. The door creaked open, and the old man stepped out, smiling. Danny slammed the brakes. The car skidded to a stop, tires screeching. His chest rose and fell in sharp, ragged breaths. The old man lifted a hand and waved. Slow, deliberate. Danny threw the car into reverse. The tires spun, kicking up dirt, but the car wasn't moving. His heart pounded. No, no, no. The old man took a step forward. Danny's vision blurred. He squeezed his eyes shut, gripping the wheel so tight his knuckles ached. Then, silence. When he opened his eyes, the gas station was gone. Just an empty road ahead. Danny's breath came in shallow gasps. He was shaking. Had he imagined it? No, because his gas gauge was full, and he still hadn't paid. For the next hour, Danny kept driving. The air in the car felt thick, suffocating. Every so often, he glanced in the mirror, terrified he'd see that flickering sign again. But he didn't. Eventually, lights appeared in the distance. A real town. Streetlights. Buildings. Civilization. Danny exhaled, gripping the wheel. He wasn't losing his mind. He made it. He pulled into a motel parking lot, the neon sign buzzing above him. Vacancy. The lobby was warm, smelling of coffee and stale cigarettes. The woman at the front desk barely looked up as he approached. A room, she asked, bored. Yeah, please. She slid a key across the counter. Danny hesitated. Hey, that gas station. A few miles back. The woman frowned. What gas station? Danny's stomach dropped. On the highway, he said. Old place. Flickering sign. Creepy old guy working there. The woman's expression darkened. There's no gas station out there, she said. Not for at least 50 miles. Danny felt dizzy. But He stopped, because there was something in her eyes. Recognition. Fear. You saw it, didn't you? She whispered. Danny swallowed. What do you mean? She leaned forward, lowering her voice. That place. It only shows up for certain people. Lost people. People who shouldn't be out there. Danny's blood ran cold. I don't know how you got away, she said, eyes flicking toward the window. But if I were you, she slid the key closer. I'd lock my door tonight. Danny took the key with shaking fingers. And outside, under the buzzing motel sign, a shadow moved in the dark, waiting. Jake had been driving for hours. The highway stretched out in an endless black ribbon under his headlights, disappearing into the darkness. The radio was off. His phone had died an hour ago. The only sound was the low hum of the engine and the rhythmic thud-thud of the tires against the cracked asphalt. It was past midnight. That was when he saw him. A lone figure standing on the side of the road, his thumbs sticking out. Jake's hands tightened on the wheel. A hitchhiker. Out here? In the middle of nowhere? The man was tall, wearing a faded hoodie with the hood pulled low over his face. His jeans were ripped at the knees. His shoes were scuffed and covered in dust. He stood unnaturally still, his arm raised, thumb stiff, unmoving. Jake felt uneasy. His foot hovered over the gas pedal, ready to keep going. But he didn't. Something about the man made him slow down. Maybe it was guilt. Leaving someone stranded in the middle of nowhere wasn't right. Maybe it was exhaustion, making him ignore his better judgment. Either way, he stopped. The hitchhiker climbed in without a word, closing the door softly behind him. Jake cleared his throat. Where are you headed? Silence. The air inside the car felt colder than it had a second ago. The man shifted in his seat, keeping his hood low, his face hidden. Jake forced a chuckle. Not much of a talker, huh? A long silence stretched between them. The road stretched on, endless and empty. Then the hitchhiker spoke. You shouldn't be out here, Jake. Jake's blood turned to ice. His hands tightened on the wheel. His voice came out hoarse. I never told you my name. The hitchhiker let out a low, quiet chuckle. You did. His voice was smooth, too smooth. Almost familiar. A long time ago. Jake swallowed hard. His heart pounded in his chest like a hammer against steel. His knuckles turned white as he gripped the steering wheel. His stomach twisted. His mind screamed at him to look, to turn his head. He did. The seat was empty. Jake's breath caught in his throat. His foot slipped off the gas. The car swerved violently. Tires screeched. The back end fishtailed. Gravel sprayed across the road as he fought for control. He yanked the wheel hard to the right, the car jerking back into the lane. His heart slammed against his ribs. His breath came in sharp, shallow gasps. He pulled over, hands shaking. For a long moment, he just sat there, gripping the wheel. His mouth was dry. His skin felt clammy, cold sweat trickling down his back. Slowly, he exhaled. His eyes flicked to the rearview mirror. The hitchhiker was in the back seat, smiling. Jake didn't scream. He couldn't. His throat was locked up, his whole body frozen in place. The hitchhiker's grin widened, showing too many teeth. "Keep driving, Jake." His voice was calm, casual, like an old friend giving a simple request. Jake's hands trembled. His mind screamed at him to run, to get out, to do anything but sit there. But his body didn't listen. He put the car in drive, and he kept going. The road stretched out ahead, swallowing them in the dark. Minutes passed, maybe hours. Jake wasn't sure anymore. The hitchhiker hadn't moved. He just sat there, grinning in the rearview mirror. Jake's skin crawled. He couldn't look at him. He focused on the road, his fingers gripping the wheels so tight they ached. "Who are you?" His voice barely worked. The hitchhiker chuckled again. "You already know." Jake swallowed. His mouth was dry. "No, I don't." "Think, Jake." The voice was different now. Softer. Familiar. Jake's grip loosened slightly. The voice, it tugged at something deep in his memory. Something buried. Something he didn't want to remember. "You left me here." Jake's chest tightened. A long time ago. The memory came flooding back. It had been years ago. Another late night, another empty road. He had been drunk. Too drunk to drive. But he had. And there had been a hitchhiker that night too. A real one. A kid. Couldn't have been more than 20. Dark hoodie, jeans with ripped knees. Jake had been swerving. The kid had stepped onto the road, waving for help. The impact had been sudden, brutal. A sickening thud. Jake had pulled over, his heart pounding, his stomach twisting into knots. The kid had been lying in the dirt, his body twisted unnaturally. Blood pooling beneath his head. Still alive. Eyes blinking up at Jake, wide and full of pain. Jake had panicked. No one had been around. No cars. No lights. He had gotten back into his car and driven away. He had left him there. Alone. Dying. Jake's breath hitched. He gripped the wheel, knuckles white. He looked in the mirror again. The hitchhiker's hood had slipped back. His face was pale. Blood matted his dark hair. His eyes, glass-like, hollow, stared straight at Jake. Jake's stomach lurched. "No," he whispered. You can't be real." The hitchhiker's head tilted slightly. "Then why are you still driving?" Jake's foot was still on the gas. The car kept moving. Mile after mile. Darkness stretched in every direction. No towns. No signs. Just road. Endless road. Jake's pulse pounded in his ears. His foot pressed harder on the pedal. Faster. Faster. The hitchhiker chuckled. "You can't outrun this, Jake." The speedometer climbed. 70, 80, 90. Jake's vision blurred. The car rattled. He slammed his foot down. 100. The hitchhiker's smile didn't waver. "You never could." Jake's breath came in ragged gasps. His fingers twitched. His chest felt tight, panic clawing at his ribs. Then, the headlights flickered. The road ahead twisted. Jake's eyes widened. A figure stood in the middle of the road. Dark hoodie. Ripped jeans. Blood dripping from his forehead. Jake screamed. He yanked the wheel. The tires skidded. The car spun. Everything turned upside down. And then, darkness. When Jake opened his eyes, he was slumped over the wheel. His head throbbed. The windshield was shattered. The hood crumpled against a tree. Smoke curled from the engine. He coughed, every breath sharp and painful. Slowly, he turned his head. The passenger seat was empty. The back seat was empty. But outside, a figure stood by the road, thumb sticking out, waiting. A chill ran down Jake's spine. The hitchhiker smiled. Need a ride? The world faded to black. Sarah had been driving for what felt like days. The steady hum of her car and the monotonous stretch of the road ahead were beginning to blur together, making time feel irrelevant. Her GPS had led her down this lonely highway, promising a shortcut that was supposed to save time. But now, after hours of driving, the screen had started glitching. Recalculating, recalculating, recalculating. The robotic voice echoed through the quiet cabin of her car, growing more erratic the further she drove. She tried to shake off the creeping feeling that something was wrong. The sky above was dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of her dashboard. The trees on either side of the road loomed like silent giants, their limbs heavy with shadows. She hadn't seen another car for miles. No gas stations. No signs of civilization. Just her, the road, and the whispering wind outside. The fuel gauge was nearing empty. Panic began to rise in her chest. She couldn't remember the last time she passed a town. Her phone had no signal, the map no longer helpful. But then, in the distance, something caught her eye. A town. The glow of streetlights flickered faintly in the distance, barely visible through the trees. It didn't look like much, just a scattering of houses, a few shops, and an old diner that stood at the corner. The sign was cracked, but the neon lights still buzzed faintly. Maggie's Diner. Her heart gave a relieved thump. At least she wasn't lost anymore. She slowed the car, the tires crunching on the gravel as she pulled into a parking space. The town felt oddly still. There was no traffic, no voices. Just the quiet. As she stepped out of the car, an unsettling chill ran up her spine. Something was off, but she couldn't put her finger on it. The air smelled stale, like it hadn't been disturbed in years. The door of the diner jingled as she pushed it open. The dim lighting inside made everything feel even more isolated. The smell of burnt coffee mixed with something darker, like rust. The floors creaked under her feet as she made her way to the counter, where an old woman stood behind it. The woman was small, with wrinkled skin and eyes that seemed to look right through Sarah. Her smile, if you could call it that, was stiff and unmoving. "We don't get visitors," the woman said flatly, her voice like sandpaper. Sarah blinked, trying to smile back. "I'm just passing through. My GPS went haywire, and I was hoping to get some directions." The woman didn't respond. Instead, she slid a chipped coffee cup towards Sarah, her expression unchanged. Sarah reached for it, her fingers trembling slightly. The cup felt warm in her hands, comforting in its familiarity. She brought it to her lips and took a sip, expecting the comforting bitterness of fresh coffee. Instead, the taste was cold. Not just cold, I see. The liquid felt as though it had been pulled straight from a freezer. Sarah almost gagged and set the cup down with a start. The coldness of the coffee seeped into her very bones, making her feel even more out of place. "Actually," Sarah said, trying to sound casual, "I just need to know which way to go to get back on the highway." But the woman just stood there, still as stone, staring at her. The silence stretched. Then the door jingled again. Sarah turned her head, expecting another customer, but when her eyes landed on the newcomer, her breath caught in her throat. A woman stood in the doorway. A woman who looked exactly like her. The same jacket, the same jeans, the same long brown hair falling in waves around her shoulders. Sarah's heart skipped. The woman smiled. Sarah's stomach twisted in confusion. It was her, but it couldn't be. The woman walked into the diner and took a seat at one of the booths, her eyes never leaving Sarah. Sarah's hands shook as she glanced back at the waitress, who had not moved a muscle. The smile on her face remained frozen, but her eyes, Sarah could feel them, locked onto her. "What's going on?" Sarah whispered, more to herself than anyone else. But the waitress didn't answer. The lights flickered, then went out completely. A cold gust of air swept through the diner, making the hairs on Sarah's neck stand on end. She felt her breath catch in her throat as the room plunged into complete darkness. Tap. It came from somewhere nearby, the sound too soft, too deliberate. Sarah's heart raced, and she spun around, her pulse pounding in her ears. The room was still empty, save for her, the waitress, and the woman. Her doppelganger was now standing behind her, so close that Sarah could feel her presence, but when she whirled around, there was no one there. Her breath was coming in ragged gasps now, her heart a frantic drumbeat in her chest. Suddenly, the diner seemed too large, the shadows too deep. Then came the whisper, soft but unmistakable. "We don't get visitors." The words hung in the air like a warning. Sarah's hands flew to her face, feeling the cold sweat on her skin. Her breath caught in her throat, but when she tried to speak, nothing came out. She spun around again, desperate for answers. But the woman, her double, was gone. And in her place, nothing. The room was empty, darker than before. The only sound was her own breath, quick and sharp in the silence. Sarah's head swam with dizziness, her thoughts fragmented. She looked down at the counter, where the cup of coffee had been. The glass was cracked, the cold liquid dripping slowly down the side. What was happening? Her hands were trembling as she reached for her phone. No signal. Her eyes darted to the door, then back to the woman behind the counter. But the waitress was still there, her frozen smile unmoving, her eyes trained on Sarah with a level of intensity that made her skin crawl. Desperation clawed at Sarah's insides. She was trapped in this place. Trapped in a town that wasn't on the map. Trapped with a version of herself that shouldn't exist. The door jingled again. Sarah's eyes flicked toward it. Her double had returned. This time, she wasn't standing at the counter. She was right behind Sarah. Sarah's heart hammered in her chest as she tried to stand up, but her legs gave way beneath her. She fell back into the booth, a cold sweat slick on her back. The woman behind her, her double, leaned in close, her breath a whisper in Sarah's ear. "You're not supposed to be here." Sarah felt the words in her bones, a chill that crawled down her spine and settled deep within her chest. The diner seemed to stretch and contort, the walls pressing in around her. The lights flickered again. And then, darkness. Sarah opened her eyes to blinding light. For a moment, she thought she had somehow woken up. But as her vision cleared, she realized something was wrong. She was no longer in the diner. She wasn't even in the town. She was standing outside her car, the cold wind biting at her skin. The night sky stretched endlessly above her, but there was no sign of the town, no lights, no buildings. Just an empty, desolate field. Her pulse surged with panic. What had happened? She reached for her phone again. No signal. Her GPS, still locked on the same location, blinked in front of her. Recalculating, recalculating, recalculating. The same endless loop. Sarah turned in a slow circle. No town. No diner. No people. Just an empty, silent stretch of land. And then, as if on cue, something moved in the distance. A shadow. A figure standing on the edge of the field. Sarah's blood ran cold. It was her. Her double. The woman smiled, and in that smile, Sarah saw nothing but emptiness, an endless, bottomless void. "You shouldn't have come here," the figure whispered. And then, before Sarah could scream, the world went dark once more. Ben had always loved the woods, so much so that he'd made it a point to camp alone in the deep, untouched wilderness whenever he could. The quiet, the solitude, it was the perfect escape from the noise and chaos of the modern world. So when he set off on this particular weekend trip, he thought nothing could go wrong. The sun was beginning to dip behind the trees as Ben set up camp. The air was crisp, and the smell of pine filled his nostrils. He took a moment to look around, appreciating the silence of it all. It was the kind of stillness that wrapped itself around you, a thick, almost tangible presence. Nothing but him and the forest. By the time he had his tent set up and his small campfire going, night had fallen. The sky above was a blanket of stars, and the distant sound of the wind rustling through the branches of the trees gave a sense of peace he hadn't realized he'd been craving. He ate a quick meal of canned beans and jerky, not caring about the simplicity. It was enough to feed his body while the forest fed his mind. He settled into his tent as the evening stretched on, listening to the crackle of the fire outside. The warmth from the flames seeped through the thin walls of his tent, but there was an unease growing inside him. A feeling deep in his gut that something wasn't right. Ben tried to ignore it, to convince himself it was just the isolation playing tricks on his mind. After all, it was a routine he had followed many times before. Nothing had ever happened. But tonight felt different, a little heavier than usual. As he lay there waiting for sleep, a sound broke through the calm. A crunch of leaves, a twig snapping. His body tensed. Footsteps. Slow. Deliberate. Someone or something was walking around his tent. The sound was unmistakable, and it made his skin crawl. Ben held his breath, straining his ears to catch every movement. His hand instinctively went to the knife tucked in his waistband, and he gripped it tightly, the cool metal sending a surge of adrenaline through his body. His pulse quickened, the footsteps getting closer, circling the tent. The air grew heavy with each step, as if the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting. Ben's mind raced. Was it an animal? A bear, maybe? No, the footsteps were too steady, too methodical. Whatever it was walking like a person. He tried to keep his breathing steady, trying to make as little noise as possible, but his heart was pounding in his ears. His fingers tightened around the knife, and he waited. The footsteps stopped. For a moment, everything was still, too still. The usual sounds of the forest had ceased. There were no more chirping insects, no more rustling leaves. The quiet was suffocating, like the whole world had stopped turning. And then the voice came. Soft. Whispering. Come out. Ben's blood ran cold. He didn't move, didn't breathe, too afraid to do anything, too afraid to make a sound. His eyes darted around the inside of the tent, but all he could see was the dim glow of his flashlight beside him. He gripped the knife tighter, the blade cold against his palm. The voice had come from outside. Someone was out there, and they knew he was inside. He swallowed hard, his throat dry, as the seconds ticked by like hours. The voice didn't come again, but he could still hear the slow, deliberate footsteps circling. It was almost as if the person, whatever it was just waiting for him to make a move, to show any sign of life. Ben tried to steady his breath, his mind racing. Who was it? What did they want? Why didn't they just leave him alone? And then nothing. Complete silence. Minutes turned into an eternity, and Ben began to wonder if he had imagined it all. Maybe it was just the wind. Maybe he was losing his mind from being out here alone for too long. But the gut-wrenching feeling didn't go away. He still felt the weight of those eyes on him, watching, waiting. He couldn't shake it. He didn't know how much time had passed. Hours? Minutes? It didn't matter. All he knew was that his body was tense, his eyes heavy, but he couldn't bring himself to close them. Every time he tried to sleep, he felt that feeling again, that sense of being watched. As the hours dragged on, the sun began to rise. The first pale light of dawn crept into the edges of the forest, casting long shadows on the ground outside. Ben had barely slept, his exhaustion beginning to take its toll. He had to get up. He needed to leave. The silence was still there, thick and oppressive, but now there was something more. Something that didn't belong. He unzipped the tent carefully, the sound of the zipper cutting through the stillness. His eyes scanned the area outside, the soft light of morning revealing a peaceful forest. Birds chirped in the distance. The woods were alive, but there was something off. Ben stepped cautiously outside, scanning the area. The campsite appeared as it had when he had gone to sleep, but something was wrong. He could feel it deep in his bones. And then he saw it. In the dirt around his tent, there were deep footprints. Huge, heavy impressions in the earth all around him. They weren't his. They circled the tent. Over and over again. Ben's breath hitched in his chest as he examined the prints. They were fresh, too fresh to have been made while he was asleep, yet they were unmistakably there. And what made them worse was the way they were arranged. They didn't lead away from the tent. They just circled, in a slow, deliberate pattern, as if whoever, or whatever, had been out there had been watching him, walking in a circle around him the entire night. But that wasn't the worst part. Ben's eyes flicked to the ground, where something was scratched into the earth. The marks were jagged and uneven, deep furrows in the dirt, like something, or someone, had been dragging a sharp object through the soil. The words were clear, unmistakable. "I watched you all night." A cold chill ran down Ben's spine. He staggered back, feeling lightheaded. The air around him felt thick, suffocating. His heart was racing, his breath shallow. His eyes darted around the forest, but there was nothing there. No sign of movement, no figure standing at the edge of the trees. But he could feel it. He wasn't alone. He wasn't sure what to do. He had to leave. He had to get out of here. But part of him didn't want to move. Part of him wanted to stay and understand, to confront whatever had been out there watching him. But that part of him felt foolish, a voice in his head screaming that it wasn't safe. He took one last look around the campsite, his eyes scanning the trees, the shadows. Nothing. His legs felt like lead as he packed up, every muscle in his body screaming to leave. But it wasn't until he was back in his car, the engine humming to life, that he finally allowed himself to relax. He drove out of the woods in a daze. The memory of those words burned into his mind. "I watched you all night." The forest was behind him now, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed him. Something was still watching. And no matter how fast he drove, no matter how far he went, he couldn't escape the feeling that the woods were still there waiting. Lisa had always loved the mountains. The winding roads, the towering trees, the silence broken only by the wind and the occasional bird call. It felt like a world all its own, a place where she could escape from the noise of her everyday life. That's why, when she had the chance for a weekend getaway, she jumped at it. She'd driven for hours, winding her way through the narrow mountain roads, the green trees thickening around her, until the world outside her car felt like a dream. The radio had stopped working hours ago, static filling the silence after she'd passed the last station. But the lack of sound didn't bother her. She was used to the quiet. Her thoughts drifted as she drove, the hum of the tires on the road lulling her into a peaceful state. She'd been here before, to the same cabin, years ago when she was younger. Her parents had taken her on trips like this when she was a child. But that was a long time ago. Everything was different now. They were gone and she was alone. The quiet wasn't as comforting anymore. It was heavier, filled with memories that had long been buried. She shook her head, trying to push the thoughts away. This was supposed to be a time of rest, a chance to forget. Then, suddenly, the silence in the car was broken by a strange crackling sound. Lisa furrowed her brow, her fingers drifting over the radio dial. She'd already tried to adjust it earlier, but it had been completely dead. The static grew louder, then fell into a strange, haunting tune. Lisa froze. The music was soft at first, a slow melody that sounded like an old love song. She recognized it. How could she forget? It was a song her mother used to play on the piano when Lisa was a little girl. The soft, melancholy notes echoed in her memory. She stared at the radio in disbelief. The song didn't make sense. There were no stations out here. The mountains were too isolated, and she hadn't passed a single house or building for miles. Her hands shook as she turned the volume knob down, hoping to stop it. But the song didn't fade. It grew louder, as if the radio had a mind of its own. The voice came next. A whisper between the static, barely audible, but clear enough to make Lisa's heart stop. "Lisa, you forgot me." Her breath caught in her throat. The voice was familiar, too familiar. It was the same voice she had heard countless times as a child, the voice of someone she hadn't thought about in years. Her heart pounded in her chest as she turned the radio off. But the song kept playing, the soft, mournful melody spilling out of the speakers like it had a life of its own. Panic surged through her. She reached for the dial again, desperately twisting it, but the music didn't stop. She slammed her hand against the radio, but it wouldn't silence. It was as though the song had become part of the car, part of the air, filling every corner of the space around her. With trembling hands, Lisa yanked the plug out of the radio, pulling it out of the dashboard. The car felt eerily quiet for a moment, until the song began to play louder, as if the radio were no longer connected to anything. She looked at the radio unit, her breath coming fast. She had disconnected it, she was sure of it. But the music still played, louder and more insistent now. Her palms were slick with sweat, and her mind raced. What was happening? "Lisa," the voice whispered again, this time louder. "You forgot me." Lisa's blood ran cold. She couldn't place it, this voice, the song, the words. She was almost afraid to understand. Her mind spun, fighting to connect the dots. The song, the voice, the memories of her mother. The realization hit her like a punch in the stomach. That voice, it wasn't just her mother's voice. It was someone else's. Someone she had buried, someone she hadn't thought about in years. Lisa's vision blurred with panic, and in a split second of desperation, she yanked the entire radio unit out of the dashboard. For a moment, there was silence. The car was still, the oppressive weight of the music gone. Relief flooded her. She sank back into her seat, gasping for air, her hands shaking as she threw the radio onto the passenger seat. It was over. It had to be. There was no more song, no more whispering voice. But the car didn't feel the same. The hairs on the back of her neck stood up, the air thickening, heavy with something dark. Lisa forced herself to look up, her eyes scanning the road ahead of her. The mountains seemed to loom around her, casting long shadows in the pale light of dusk. Her breath came in shallow gasps as she peered ahead, the road stretching out into the dark woods. And then she saw it. Standing in the middle of the road, just a few feet away, was a figure. A man. At first, Lisa thought it was just a trick of the light, her mind playing games with her. But as she got closer, she could see the details. His face was pale, gaunt, hollow-eyed, as if he hadn't seen the light of day in years. His clothes were torn and dirty, hanging off his body in a way that made him look almost skeletal. Her foot slammed down on the brakes, but it was too late. The car swerved violently, the steering wheel jerking out of her hands as she tried to regain control. The tires screeched, the world outside spinning into a blur of trees and darkness. And then the crash. The impact jolted her, her head slamming against the wheel, the world turning black. The car came to a stop, the engine sputtering, the radio still crackling in the background. Lisa groaned, her vision blurry, but her mind felt strangely clear. She tried to move, tried to open her eyes, but it was like something heavy was pressing down on her chest. And then, in the silence that followed, the radio crackled one final time. "Now you remember." The words echoed in her ears as the world around her went dark.